In every university, behind every quiet lecture and polished resume, there are stories that never make it to the surface. Stories of ambition, pressure, and the kind of darkness that intelligence alone cannot hide. This is one of those stories. The story of a woman who was brilliant, gifted, and respected, yet haunted by something she could never escape. Her name was Amy Bishop. She was a Harvard-educated neuroscientist, a mother of four, and a professor at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. To her students, she was inspiring, sharp, confident, and intimidatingly smart. To her colleagues, she was someone with a reputation for being intense, sometimes too intense. No one around her could have imagined that she would one day be at the center of one of the most shocking tragedies in American academic history. But to understand that moment, we have to go back to where it all began, in the quiet suburb of Braintree, Massachusetts. Amy Bishop was born in 1965, the eldest child in a close-knit family. Her father, Samuel, taught art at a local university. Her mother, Judy, was active in local politics. They valued education and creativity, and Amy thrived in that environment. From an early age, she stood out as gifted, the kind of child who always wanted to be the best, who corrected her teachers, who devoured books and experiments. She was the girl people pointed to and said, "She's going places." Her brother, Seth, was 3 years younger, gentle, athletic, and adored by everyone who met him. The two siblings had a typical relationship, teasing, competing, laughing. But while Seth's charm made him easy to love, Amy's intensity often made her difficult to approach. Friends from childhood would later describe her as brilliant but moody, capable of kindness one moment and anger the next. That Amy's family believed her intelligence would lead her far. And they were right. In 1983, she entered Harvard University, where she studied biology. She wanted to understand the brain, what made it work, what made it fail, what made people human. She spent long nights in labs, buried in notes and theories, determined to prove herself. Professors saw her potential and described her as one of their brightest students. But Amy had another side, one that didn't take failure well. She wasn't used to being questioned or told no. Small criticisms would ignite something deep in her. One classmate remembered, if she thought someone didn't respect her intelligence, she'd never let it go. For years, that tension built quietly, invisible to everyone around her. Until one winter afternoon in 1986, when everything shattered. It was December 6th. Amy was 21, home from Harvard for the holidays. Her brother Seth was 18. Their parents were home too, decorating for Christmas. Nothing about that morning stood out. There were no signs that the day would end in tragedy. But sometime in the late morning, an argument broke out. No one knows exactly what it was about. Maybe a small family disagreement, maybe something deeper. But what happened next would change everything. Amy went to her father's bedroom closet. Inside was a 12-gauge shotgun, a weapon her father kept for protection. She took it out, loaded it, and carried it downstairs. Her mother, hearing the noise, asked what she was doing. Amy said nothing. Then her brother Seth appeared at the bottom of the stairs. The next moment was chaos that a loud blast echoed through the house. Seth collapsed to the floor, struck in the chest. He never had a chance. Amy froze. Her mother screamed. In the confusion, no one knew whether it was an accident or something worse. But Amy didn't stay to explain. She dropped the gun, ran outside, and fled down the street. Witnesses later described seeing a young woman wandering with a shotgun, her face pale, her eyes wide. She made her way to a nearby auto dealership, where she pointed the gun at a man and demanded his car keys. "I need your car," she said, trembling. The man, terrified, hesitated, and at that moment, police arrived. Amy was ordered to the ground. After a brief standoff, she dropped the weapon and was taken into custody. It should have been a clear case. A fatal shooting followed by an attempted carjacking. But what happened next was almost as shocking as the crime itself. Within hours, the story began to fade. Police ruled Seth's death an accident. They said Amy had been trying to unload the shotgun and that it went off by mistake. The carjacking attempt was described as confusion, a young woman acting out of panic, and grief. No charges were filed. The case was quietly closed. Amy's mother supported the story, that it had been an accident. The family withdrew from the public eye, mourning privately. Neighbors whispered, but in time, they stopped asking questions. And just like that, the shooting, the car incident, the fear, all of it was buried. Amy returned to Harvard the following semester. Her professors didn't ask about the incident. Her classmates never knew. She graduated, earned her PhD, and moved forward as if the past had been erased. But the past doesn't erase that easily. It lingers, quietly, invisibly, waiting for the right moment to reappear. For Amy, the next 2 decades were a blur of ambition and reinvention. She married James Anderson, a kind, patient man who believed in her completely. Together, they had 4 children. Amy continued her academic career, conducting research in molecular biology and genetics. She published papers, taught classes, attended conferences. To the outside world, she was the picture of success, but those who worked with her began to notice things. She could be charming one moment, furious the next. She'd argue with colleagues over small details. She often believed she wasn't being respected enough, that others were trying to undermine her work. Some students admired her brilliance. Others found her intimidating. A colleague once said, "She was one of the smartest people in the department, but you always felt like you were walking on eggshells around her." Still, her reputation grew. The University of Alabama in Huntsville offered her a position as an assistant professor of biology. She accepted, and for a while, it seemed like everything she'd ever wanted was finally coming true. She had the title, the lab, the recognition, but Amy's mind never stopped racing. She wanted more: tenure, prestige, permanent respect in the academic world. And when that goal began to slip away, when she sensed rejection once again hovering in her future, the same storm that had once erupted in her family home began to stir again inside her. Because for Amy Bishop, failure wasn't just disappointing. It was unbearable. She had built her identity on the idea that she was exceptional, that she was destined for greatness. Every no, every criticism, every obstacle felt personal, and deep beneath the surface, that same unresolved darkness from 1986, the one buried under silence, excuses, and denial, was waiting. It waited through every lecture she gave, every experiment she performed, every polite smile she offered in the faculty lounge. It waited quietly, patiently, until one day, years later, it found its way back, and when it did, it wouldn't just destroy Amy Bishop's career, it would destroy lives. The story of what happened next would shock the academic world, reopen a forgotten case, and raise one haunting question: how does someone so intelligent, so accomplished, lose control so completely? The answer begins where her second fall begins, inside the walls of the University of Alabama in Huntsville. When Amy Bishop arrived at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, it felt like a new beginning. She was in her late 30s, confident, experienced, and ready to prove herself in a department that valued innovation. Her focus was neuroscience, the study of the human brain, the very organ that had fascinated her since her youth. To her, this job wasn't just another step in her career. It was validation, proof that all her years of hard work had been worth it. First, her colleagues admired her determination. She spoke passionately about her research and had grand plans for her lab. She wanted to uncover new insights into neurological disorders, and she believed that if she could just secure funding, her discoveries would bring recognition to the entire university. But it didn't take long for people to notice something different about her. Amy could be intense in conversation, so intense that even small disagreements could turn into heated debates. In faculty meetings, she'd interrupt others, challenge them, sometimes glare across the room if she felt dismissed. When she believed someone questioned her intelligence, she would hold on to it, replaying it in her mind again and again. One of her former colleagues would later say, "Amy didn't just want to be right. She needed to be right." Students had mixed experiences. Some admired her knowledge and energy. Others avoided her classes altogether. She was known to grade harshly and could be unpredictable, encouraging one moment, cutting the next. But her professional record, on paper, was solid. She was publishing papers, attending conferences, and building a reputation. She wanted tenure, the ultimate symbol of academic permanence, the thing that would finally silence her inner doubts. Tenure means security. It means belonging. For most professors, it's the finish line of years of sacrifice. But for Amy, it became an obsession. She saw it not just as a career goal, but as proof of her worth. In 2009, after several years at the university, her tenure review began. The process was rigorous, involving evaluations of her research, teaching, and relationships with colleagues. Amy expected to pass easily. She believed her credentials, her degrees, and her publications spoke for themselves. But as the committee met, concerns were raised. Her research output was not as strong as expected. Her relationships with others in the department were strained. There were complaints from students about her behavior. And then came the news she couldn't accept. Her tenure was denied. To most people, that would be a painful professional setback. To Amy, it was an existential blow. She saw it as betrayal, a conspiracy against her brilliance. She began to believe that her colleagues had plotted to keep her out, that the system was rigged. In her mind, she wasn't being evaluated, she was being attacked. The rejection began to consume her. She talked about it constantly at home, replaying every meeting, every slight, every imagined insult. Her husband tried to calm her, but she couldn't let it go. She told him she had been wronged, that she was the victim of politics and jealousy. Her emails to administrators became emotional, sometimes angry. She demanded explanations, appealed the decision, and accused others of undermining her work. She didn't see it as a setback to recover from. She saw it as war. And yet, outwardly, she still taught her classes, smiled for colleagues, and went through the motions of normal life. Her students saw only a fraction of the turmoil inside her, but those closest to her began to sense something dark growing. She spoke more often about how unfair life had been, how the world didn't appreciate true talent, how people always try to keep her down. Her anger, once private, began to spill out in subtle, unsettling ways. Then came the small incidents, the kind people shrug off at first. She argued with another professor over lab equipment. She complained that students were being turned against her. She accused the department of sabotaging her experiments. Each confrontation ended the same way. Amy felt cornered, humiliated, and determined to fight back. Her husband, James, remained loyal. He believed she was simply under stress. He told friends she was brilliant, misunderstood, overworked. He didn't see, or maybe didn't want to see, how close she was to breaking up. By late 2009, Amy's position at the university was slipping away. Her final appeal for tenure was denied. Her contract was set to end later that year. She would lose her job, her research funding, and the identity she had built her entire life around. But instead of accepting defeat, Amy began to plan something. In January 2010, just weeks before the end of her employment, she continued to show up on campus as if nothing had changed. She still attended meetings, still spoke about her work, still argued about academic matters as if she had a future there. To outsiders, it seemed strange. Why attend meetings for a job that was already lost? To Amy, it made perfect sense. She wasn't ready to let go. Those around her noticed her behavior shifting. She seemed distracted, sometimes distant, other times unusually cheerful. No one knew what to make of it. Some thought she was finally coming to terms with things. Others quietly worried. Then came February 12, 2010, a day that began like any other on campus. It was a Friday. The biology department scheduled a regular faculty meeting for that afternoon. A small group of professors gathered in a conference room to discuss departmental matters, upcoming classes, budgets, lab maintenance. It was the kind of ordinary, uneventful meeting that filled every academic calendar. Amy arrived a few minutes late, carrying her purse. She sat down quietly, nodded at her colleagues, and listened as the chair began to speak. No one thought much of her presence. She was still technically on staff, but inside that purse was a 9mm handgun. She sat there, silent, her face calm, her expression unreadable. The discussion moved on: budgets, curriculum, faculty workloads. Then, without warning, Amy reached into her bag. What happened next took less than a minute. She stood up, pulled out the gun, and began firing. The first shot struck a colleague across the table. Another followed. The room erupted in screams. Chairs fell, papers flew, people tried to crawl under the table or run for the door. In total, 6 professors were shot. 3 died instantly. 3 others were wounded. Witnesses later described it as silent chaos. No shouting, no words from Amy, just the sound of gunfire and shock. When the weapon jammed, Amy calmly set it down, walked out of the room and made her way down the hallway. She didn't run. She didn't hide. She just walked. Someone called 911. Within minutes, police arrived. They found her outside the building, sitting quietly. She told them, "It didn't happen. There's no way it happened." But it had. The university was in disbelief. The news spread across the country within hours. The headlines were everywhere. University professor opens fire on colleagues during faculty meeting. For those who knew her, the question was the same. How could someone like Amy Bishop do something like this? But when investigators began to dig into her past, they uncovered something no one at the university had known. Something buried for more than 2 decades. They found the old police reports from 1986. The shotgun, the brother, the carjacking attempt. Suddenly, the pieces of Amy Bishop's life began to make a terrifying kind of sense. The violent act that had once been written off as an accident now looked like the first sign of a mind capable of much darker things. And yet, for 24 years, she had lived freely, building a career, a family, a reputation. The system that should have stopped her long ago had instead allowed her to rise. When police questioned her after the shooting, she seemed detached, almost confused. She asked whether her colleagues were dead, then denied any memory of what happened. Psychologists who later examined her would debate her mental state, whether she was driven by rage, delusion, or something deeper. But one thing was clear. The pattern had finally come full circle. The anger that had once taken her brother's life had resurfaced. The mind that studied the brain had turned against itself. Amy Bishop, the Harvard-trained scientist, had become Amy Bishop, the murderer. And as investigators pieced together the story, they began to uncover not only the tragedy of that February day, but also the long trail of warning signs that had been ignored, overlooked, and forgotten. The storm that had begun in her family home had returned. Stronger and more devastating than ever. It had taken 24 years, but it had found her again. The hours after the shooting were filled with disbelief. Police cars surrounded the university. Students were locked in classrooms. News helicopters hovered overhead. Reporters scrambled to piece together what had happened, who the shooter was, why she had done it, and how something so horrific could have unfolded in a quiet academic building on an ordinary Friday afternoon. The name Dr. Amy Bishop spread quickly. A Harvard-educated neuroscientist, a mother of 4, a respected, if eccentric, professor to the public. It didn't make sense. How could someone like her, a scientist devoted to studying the human mind, carry out an act so cold and deliberate? As police began their investigation, they learned the victims were all faculty members who had worked alongside her for years. Some had voted against her tenure. Others had simply been in the room that day. 3 of them, Dr. Gopi Padala, the department chair, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, and Dr. Audrielle Johnson, were dead. 3 others were badly wounded. Amy Bishop was taken into custody without resistance. She said little at first, sitting quietly as detectives questioned her. When asked if she had done it, she reportedly muttered, "It didn't happen. They're still alive." But soon, a story began to form. Detectives searched her office and home. They found documents about her tenure case, angry letters, and notes that seemed to obsess over perceived betrayals. They also found the handgun, legally purchased, and evidence that she had practiced shooting. To police, it looked premeditated. But they wanted to understand why. They dug deeper. They started hearing strange things from her colleagues. Stories about her temper, her paranoia, her sense of being wronged. One professor recalled her angrily confronting people during meetings. Another described how she would fixate on perceived slights for months. Yet even those who had clashed with her never imagined she could turn violent. Then, a week after the shooting, an old newspaper clipping landed on a reporter's desk in Massachusetts. It was from 1986. The headline read, "Braintree teen accidentally kills brother with shotgun." The girl's name? Amy Bishop. The revelation hit like a thunderclap. The incident, long forgotten by most, had been ruled an accident more than 20 years earlier. But now, with Amy in custody for murder, that accident suddenly seemed worth revisiting. The local police chief in Braintree, Massachusetts, where the 1986 shooting happened, decided to reopen the case files. What they found shocked even veteran officers. According to the old reports, Amy had shot her brother Seth, aged 18, in their family home. He died instantly. Amy, then 21, had fled the house with the shotgun, pointed it at a passing car, and ordered the driver to stop. When he drove away, she ran to a nearby car dealership, still carrying the gun, and demanded a car. Police found her moments later, holding the weapon. She was arrested but released soon after. The case was quietly ruled accidental, but as investigators re-examined the file in 2010, they found gaps, missing reports, contradictory statements, and inconsistencies in how the case was handled. One retired officer told reporters, "It was no accident. We knew that. But back then, something stopped the investigation. No one knew exactly what, whether it was influence, sympathy, or simply poor procedure. But one thing was clear. Amy Bishop had a history of violence that had been buried for decades. The new discovery transformed the Huntsville shooting from an isolated tragedy into a chilling revelation. The woman who had killed 3 colleagues in a university meeting room had also killed her brother years earlier. And somehow, she had never been held accountable. The media pounced. Headlines called her the professor who got away with murder. Reporters dug into her life, uncovering more strange details. They found that after the 1986 shooting, Amy had gone on to Harvard, earned her PhD, married, and built a career. She had filed several patents, taught classes, and even received federal research grants. She had appeared to move past that day, but perhaps the trauma never left her. Some psychologists would later suggest that Amy suffered from narcissistic rage, a deep sense of entitlement and grievance that festered for years. Others thought she might have had an undiagnosed mental illness. But to those who had lost loved ones in Huntsville, the explanations didn't matter. They wanted justice. Meanwhile, the town of Braintree grappled with its own guilt. If the truth about the 1986 shooting had been properly investigated, would 3 professors still be alive? Had the system failed not once, but twice? One retired officer said bluntly, "If we'd done our job back then, those people in Alabama would be alive today." Amy's defense team argued that she was mentally ill, that she didn't fully comprehend her actions. But prosecutors painted a different picture, one of a brilliant but volatile woman who couldn't handle rejection. They pointed to the pattern. In 1986, when confronted by family conflict, she reacted with violence. In 2010, when confronted by professional failure, she did the same. 2 different moments. 2 different worlds. One terrifying similarity in the months after her arrest. More unsettling details emerged. Former co-workers described how she had once assaulted a woman in a restaurant after being denied a booster seat for her child. Others mentioned how she would fixate on people she felt had wronged her, writing long, angry emails or rants about perceived conspiracies that seemed that every time Amy faced rejection, something inside her snapped. The university community mourned deeply. Memorial services were held for the victims, attended by hundreds of students and faculty. For many, it was hard to reconcile the image of their colleague, the intelligent, ambitious professor, with the woman who had turned a faculty meeting into a massacre. One survivor later said, "She looked so calm. There was no emotion. She just stood up and started shooting, like she'd been waiting for that moment." In 2012, Amy Bishop pleaded guilty to capital murder in exchange for avoiding the death penalty. She was sentenced to life in prison without parole. For the first time, the woman who had spent her life studying the human mind would spend her remaining years confined within it, trapped inside the walls of her own making. But the story didn't end there. The reopening of the 1986 case led to a wave of investigations. The state of Massachusetts launched an inquiry into how the earlier shooting had been mishandled. Officials admitted that key evidence had been ignored. It became a case study in failure, a reminder of how systems can overlook red flags until it's too late. For criminologists, Amy Bishop became a haunting example of unresolved violence, how an early act of aggression, if unacknowledged, can grow silently in the shadows of a person's life. For academics, it was a different kind of lesson, about pressure, ego, and isolation. The path to success in academia can be lonely and unforgiving. Rejection is common. Tenure can feel like a judgment not just of your work, but of your identity. Most people face that disappointment and move on. But for Amy Bishop, it became the trigger that ended lives, and for the families of the victims, no amount of psychological explanation could fill the silence left behind. Years later, The University of Alabama in Huntsville still carries the weight of that day. A plaque hangs in the biology department to honor those who were lost. Every February, students and faculty gather to remember them and to remind each other that brilliance without empathy can be dangerous. That intelligence without stability can destroy as easily as it creates in a world built on logic and reason. Amy Bishop's story is a chilling contradiction. A scientist who could map the brain but not understand her own. Her life remains one of the most disturbing intersections between academia, ego, and violence in modern American history. It began with a car that stopped on a quiet Massachusetts street and ended in a conference room 1,200 miles away. The same mind that once sought to unlock the mysteries of human behavior had, in the end, become the most terrifying mystery of all. The courtroom was silent when the sentence was read. Amy Bishop, once a rising academic star, now a convicted murderer, stood expressionless as the judge declared her fate. Life in prison without the possibility of parole. There were no gasps, no outbursts. Just a heavy quiet that seemed to settle on everyone in the room. For the families of the victims, it was justice, but not peace. Nothing could bring back the lives that had been taken on that February afternoon. For the university community, the scars ran deeper than anyone could see. Months after the shooting, classrooms reopened. Students returned, faculty members resumed their research, and life slowly tried to find its rhythm again. But it wasn't the same. The biology department had lost its sense of safety. The illusion that academia was somehow immune to the chaos of the outside world. In every meeting, every quiet corridor, there was an unspoken tension, a memory that refused to fade. The desks in that conference room were replaced. The walls were repainted. But the space itself felt haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of what had happened there. The new department chair described it years later. It's impossible to forget. Every time we sit down to discuss something, there's this moment, a pause, like everyone's remembering. The tragedy forced the university to ask painful questions. Could it have been prevented? Were there warning signs? Had anyone missed a chance to stop her before it was too late? In the months following the attack, investigations revealed that yes, there had been signs. Amy Bishop had shown clear behavioral red flags long before the shooting. She had argued violently with colleagues, filed strange complaints, and expressed paranoia about people conspiring against her. She had once been escorted out of a faculty meeting after an outburst. But in the culture of academia, eccentricity is often tolerated, even expected. Passion, obsession, and intensity are common traits among researchers and professors. So when Amy's behavior became erratic, many dismissed it as stress or personality conflict. Few imagined it was a precursor to violence. After the shooting, universities across the United States began reassessing how they dealt with behavioral concerns among staff and students. New threat assessment teams were created. Mental health support became a talking point in academic conferences. For the first time, universities began treating psychological safety with the same seriousness as lab safety. But these reforms came too late for those who had already been lost. The story of Amy Bishop spread far beyond Huntsville. It became a grim case study, not just in criminal psychology, but in how ambition, isolation, and rejection can intertwine in dangerous ways. For psychiatrists, she was a puzzle. For sociologists, a symptom. For her victims' families, a wound that would never fully close. That Amy's life behind bars was quiet. She rarely gave interviews. When she did, her words were evasive, sometimes remorseful, sometimes defensive. She claimed not to remember the shooting clearly. At other times, she spoke of betrayal, of conspiracies, of injustice. To many, it sounded like the same internal storm that had been raging inside her for decades. She spent her days in a correctional facility in Alabama, isolated from the world she once fought so hard to belong to. Her husband, who had stood by her for much of the ordeal, eventually distanced himself. Her children, now adults, built lives far from the shadow of her name. And in Braintree, Massachusetts, the place where everything had begun, the echoes of the past still lingered. People remembered the day in 1986 when a young woman shot her brother, and how quickly the case had been swept aside. The police chief who reopened it in 2010 called it a failure that cost lives. That single decision, to treat a shooting as an accident rather than a crime, had set the stage for a future tragedy. It became a chilling reminder of how the things we choose not to confront often return to confront us later. For scholars of criminology, Amy Bishop's life is often described as a chain of missed interventions, moments when someone could have stepped in, but didn't. There was the night of the shotgun death, the years of unchecked anger, the growing paranoia in her professional life. Each link in the chain led to the next, unbroken, until the day it finally snapped. But perhaps the most unsettling part of Amy's story wasn't what she did. It was how ordinary her surroundings were. A family home in a Massachusetts suburb, a university meeting room in Alabama. Two scenes of violence separated by decades, yet connected by one mind unable to reconcile failure. In both moments, the same pattern appeared: pressure, rejection, explosion. Psychologists call it cognitive collapse under ego threat, when someone's entire identity is built around success, and the loss of that identity feels like death. For Amy Bishop, her academic achievements weren't just accomplishments, they were armor. Every paper published, every title earned, was another layer of protection against a lifetime of insecurity. When that armor cracked, she lashed out. Her story has since been dissected in documentaries, criminal studies, and university ethics courses. Not because it offers simple answers, but because it exposes uncomfortable truths about human ambition, how thin the line can be between genius and instability, how pride, when left unchecked, can become its own form of madness, how a brilliant mind can still be a dangerous one. In the end, Amy Bishop's name became a symbol of both brilliance and destruction. At Harvard, where she once studied, her case is sometimes discussed quietly among students of neuroscience and psychology. The irony is haunting. A woman who studied the biology of the brain would one day be studied for her brain at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Every new generation of students walks past the memorial plaques, names etched in brass: Dr. Gopi K. Padala, Dr. Maria Ragland Davis, Dr. Audrielle Johnson. 3 lives lost to a tragedy born of denial, anger, and missed warnings. Their families still attend the annual remembrance service. Candles are lit. Speeches are short. No one says her name anymore. And yet, her presence lingers, not as a person, but as a question. How could it have gone so far? Some find comfort in believing she was simply evil. Others, that she was sick. But perhaps the hardest truth is that she was both: a person shaped by intelligence and ego, undone by her inability to face failure. If there is a lesson in Amy Bishop's story, it's this: brilliance is not a substitute for balance. Achievement does not erase accountability. And ignoring the cracks in someone's mind doesn't make them disappear, it only lets them spread. More than a decade after the shooting, the echoes still ripple through both academia and law enforcement. Protocols have changed. Warning signs are taken more seriously. And yet, every so often, when another workplace tragedy occurs, her story surfaces again, a grim reminder of what happens when anger is left to grow in silence. Amy Bishop's life began as a tale of potential, a gifted student destined for success. It ended as a cautionary legend, a name whispered in lecture halls as an example of what happens when intellect loses its empathy. In the sterile, echoing corridors of the university, students pass by the biology lab that once housed her research. The equipment has changed. The name on the door is different. But for those who know the story, the air still feels heavy. It's the weight of memory, the kind that no renovation, no fresh coat of paint can erase. And somewhere, in a quiet prison cell, the woman who once studied the most complex organ in the human body lives with the simplest truth of all: that brilliance without humanity is the darkest kind of blindness. Time has a strange way of dulling pain but sharpening memory. Years passed after the shooting at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. Yet the story of Amy Bishop remained etched into the collective consciousness of academia, a cautionary tale that refused to fade into obscurity for those who lived through it. The memories stayed vivid: the cold February air, the sound of sirens echoing through campus, the stunned silence that followed the gunfire. For others, professors, students, parents, her story became something more abstract, a symbol of the fragile balance between intellect and instability across the United States. Universities began to change the way they looked at their people. It was no longer enough to evaluate research output and teaching effectiveness. Institutions started to ask a harder question. Are we seeing the human being behind the credentials? Threat assessment teams became standard. Faculty were encouraged to report troubling behavior, not as gossip or punishment, but as early intervention. Campus police trained with psychologists. Counseling centers received new funding. The culture began to shift, slowly, from silence to awareness. For years, academia had celebrated the myth of the brilliant eccentric, the idea that genius often comes with volatility, and that such volatility should be tolerated in the name of creativity. But Amy Bishop's case shattered that myth. It revealed that beneath the veil of eccentricity, there can lie untreated illness, resentment, or unacknowledged trauma. In that sense, her legacy was paradoxical. She destroyed lives, yet her actions forced institutions to protect others. Her story became the dark mirror through which academia finally saw itself more clearly. When journalists revisited Amy's earlier life, a complex picture emerged. She wasn't a monster from the beginning. She was gifted, curious, ambitious, the kind of child who spent hours reading science books and dreaming of discoveries that might change the world. Her teachers remembered her as intense and passionate, though sometimes withdrawn. She wasn't dangerous then, just driven. But as the years went by, something hardened inside her. Each setback cut deeper than the last. Each criticism became a wound that never healed. Her intelligence, instead of bringing her peace, magnified her suffering. It's easy to forget that genius can be isolating. The higher the expectations, the harder the fall. For Amy, failure wasn't a moment. It was a collapse of identity. And when identity collapses, reason often collapses with it. Psychologists studying her case used it to explore the concept of ego fragility in high achievers. The idea that when someone ties their entire sense of self-worth to performance, even the smallest rejection can feel catastrophic. Her life became a study in how brilliance without emotional grounding can spiral into destruction. And yet, her story isn't just about one woman's mind. It's about the culture that surrounded her. In academia, success often demands perfection. You publish or you perish. You win grants or you lose your lab. You earn tenure or you disappeared. It's a world where praise is currency and failure feels like exile. And in that pressure cooker, people like Amy, gifted, proud, and psychologically fragile, can lose their way, the forgotten victims as the years passed. Attention slowly drifted from Amy Bishop to the people whose lives she ended. Dr. Gopi K. Padala, the department chair, was known for his kindness and integrity. He was the kind of leader who encouraged collaboration rather than competition. He believed science should serve humanity, not ego. His death was a loss not just to the university, but to every student he mentored. Dr. Maria Ragland Davis had been a groundbreaking biologist who worked tirelessly to inspire young women in science. She was a mother, a mentor, and a researcher whose passion was contagious. Her colleagues remembered her laughter and the way her eyes lit up when she talked about her students' achievements. Dr. Adrielle Johnson was a respected microbiologist and one of the few African-American professors in the department. He dedicated his career to helping underrepresented students pursue science. His loss left a void that went far beyond the lab. Each of them had families, friends, dreams, and unfinished projects, all taken away in a single burst of gunfire. Their names are carved into memorial plaques, but their stories live on in the generations of students they inspired. Every graduation ceremony, every research breakthrough, carries a quiet echo of their work. The world remembers the name Amy Bishop because of her crime, but the world owes remembrance to those who lived for knowledge, not destruction. When the Braintree case was reopened in 2010, it forced an uncomfortable national conversation. How had someone who killed her brother, threatened people with a shotgun, and attempted to flee in a stolen car been released within hours? The answer was murky, part bureaucracy, part privilege, part disbelief. The officers who had handled the case back in 1986 said they had followed orders. The records were incomplete. Evidence was missing. One of the detectives who later revisited the case described it bluntly. If Amy Bishop had been charged back then, The Huntsville shooting never would have happened. The 1986 shooting became a case study in institutional failure. The consequences of leniency and the cost of forgetting. It also reignited debate about how society treats mental illness among the intelligent and successful. Are we more willing to excuse erratic behavior when it comes from someone we perceive as gifted? Do we confuse brilliance with immunity from accountability? In Amy's case, those questions had deadly answers. Every tragedy leaves behind a mirror, one that forces society to look at itself. Amy Bishop's story reflects more than just one person's descent into violence. It reveals how fragile the line is between intellect and instability, how easily brilliance can mask suffering, and how institutions built on logic can fail to see emotional reality when you strip away the headlines, the courtrooms, and the academic jargon. What remains is a simple, haunting truth. A person who could have been helped wasn't. A system that could have intervened didn't, and a tragedy that could have been prevented wasn't. That's the enduring legacy of this story. Not just the crime, but the silence that led to it in the quiet halls of universities today. When a student shows signs of distress, or when a professor begins to unravel under pressure, there's a growing awareness, a whisper that says, "We've seen this before." It's a small change, but it's something. In 2025, 15 years after the Huntsville shooting, the story is still told, not in news headlines anymore, but in classrooms, documentaries, and podcasts. Students hear about Amy Bishop as part of lessons on workplace safety, academic culture, and psychological resilience. Her story has become both warning and study, a paradox that blends tragedy with instruction. And somewhere, in a quiet corner of an Alabama prison, the woman herself remains mostly forgotten. Her once brilliant mind, the same mind that mapped neurons and sought cures for neurological disease, now spends its days in stillness. No labs, no papers, no recognition. Only reflection. If she still thinks about that day in 1986 or that day in 2010, no one knows. She doesn't write letters. She doesn't grant interviews. The silence that follows her now is the same silence she once imposed on others. But the world has not forgotten the lessons her story left behind, because every time someone notices a colleague's distress, every time a university takes a threat seriously, every time a campus chooses compassion over denial, a small part of that history is rewritten. And perhaps that's the only redemption this story can offer, that from one person's darkness, others learn to see the warning signs before it's too late. Amy Bishop's name may one day fade from memory, but the shadow of what she did and what it revealed will always remain a reminder that the most dangerous minds are not those we fear from afar, but the ones we fail to understand when they sit beside us.